I am Vincent Lampert, a Catholic priest and exorcist for the Archdiocese of Indianapolis. What I'm about to share is a true story, one that was relayed to me by a fellow priest set in the summer of 1983 in Litchfield, Connecticut. To protect the identities of those involved, I changed their names, but every detail of this account remains faithful to what happened. This is not a tale meant to scare you for its own sake, but a testament to the battle between faith and the chaotic forces of evil. Tonight, I invite you to listen to the story of Pat Reading and her encounter with Leviathan, the ancient serpent of the sea described in the book of Job. Let's begin. In the quiet outskirts of Litchfield, Connecticut, nestled near the still waters of Bantam Lake, the Reading family lived a simple life on their small farm. Pat Reading, a 32-year-old mother and homemaker, spent her days tending to her husband Frank and their 8-year-old son Tommy. The farm was modest, a few acres of rolling fields with a barn for livestock, a stable for their 2 horses, and a weathered farmhouse that had stood for generations. Pat was a Catholic, though her faith was more a quiet backdrop than a daily practice, her time consumed by chores and family. Life was predictable, even monotonous, until the summer nights began to hum with an unsettling energy. It started with the dogs. A pack of strays from the nearby woods began gathering around the farm's livestock pens after dusk. Their barking wasn't the usual clamor of hungry animals. It was frantic, almost mournful, echoing through the fields like a warning. Pat first noticed it on a warm July evening, standing on the porch with a glass of iced tea, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The dogs' howls carried over the breeze, sharp and relentless, as if they were circling something unseen. She mentioned it to Frank, who dismissed it as raccoons or coyotes stirring trouble. Just animals being animals, he said, wiping sweat from his brow after a long day in the fields, but the barking didn't stop. Night after night it grew louder, more insistent, until Pat began to feel a knot of unease in her chest. One morning while cleaning the horse stable, Pat's shovel hit something hard in the damp earth near the back wall. She knelt down, brushing away dirt, and unearthed a strange object, a massive seashell, nearly a foot long, its surface worn but etched with an intricate carving. The image was unmistakable, a serpent coiled around a scepter, its scales glinting faintly in the morning light. Pat had never seen anything like it. Bantam Lake was nearby, but it was a freshwater lake, not an ocean, and this shell looked ancient, like something dredged from the depths of a forgotten sea. She ran her fingers over the carving, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. It was beautiful in a haunting way, and she couldn't bring herself to leave it buried. She brought it into the farmhouse, setting it on the kitchen counter, thinking it might be a curiosity to show Tommy. That night, the dreams began. Pat found herself standing on the shore of Bantam Lake, the water black and endless under a starless sky. Something moved beneath the surface, massive and deliberate, its ripples lapping at her feet. A voice, low and guttural, called her name, not Pat, but Patricia, drawn out like a hiss. It promised her power, control over the chaos of her life, the endless chores, the monotony of the farm, the quiet frustrations of a mother and wife. She woke gasping, her nightgown soaked with sweat, her hands trembling. The dream returned the next night and the next, each time more vivid, the voice clearer. She saw the serpent from the shell, its eyes glowing like embers, its body coiling through the water, pulling her toward the depths. By the end of the week, Pat was different. Frank noticed it first. She snapped at him over small things, a spilled coffee mug, a late chore, her voice sharp in a way it had never been. She shouted into empty rooms, as if arguing with someone only she could see. Worse, her body began to show strange marks. Bruises appeared on her arms and legs, faint at first, then darker, their patterns resembling fish scales, though no injury explained them. Tommy, a sensitive boy who loved drawing pictures of the farm's animals, asked why his mother's skin looked like a snake. Pat brushed it off, but her eyes were distant, her hands clutching the seashell whenever she sat at the kitchen table. Frank, a practical man who preferred the rhythm of planting and harvesting to church pews, grew worried. He called their family doctor, Harold Jenkins, a kind man who'd known the Readings for years. Dr. Jenkins examined Pat, checking her vitals and asking about stress or illness. He found nothing, no fever, No infection, no explanation for the bruises. But during the visit, Pat's demeanor shifted. She stared at Dr. Jenkins, her eyes unblinking, and spoke in a voice that wasn't hers, low, gravelly, almost masculine. "Leviathan," she said, the word rolling off her tongue like a curse. Dr. Jenkins froze, unsure if he'd heard correctly. Frank, standing nearby, felt his stomach drop. He wasn't a scholar of Scripture, but he'd heard the name Leviathan in church. As a boy, a creature of chaos, a monster of the deep, untamable by man. That evening, Frank drove to Street Anthony's, the local Catholic church, and sought out Bishop Robert Ellis, a seasoned priest known for his quiet wisdom. Frank wasn't one for dramatic stories, but he poured out everything: the dogs, the shell, Pat's dreams, the bruises, and that unnatural voice. Bishop Ellis listened, his face calm but his eyes sharp with concern. He'd heard of such things before, though never in Litchfield. "This may be beyond medicine," he told Frank. "I'll come to the farm tomorrow." When Bishop Ellis arrived, the air felt heavy, as if a storm were brewing, though the sky was clear. He carried a small case with holy water, a crucifix, and a worn copy of the Roman Ritual, the book used for exorcisms. Inside the farmhouse, Pat sat at the kitchen table, the seashell in her hands. She didn't look up as the bishop entered, but her lips moved, muttering words in a language Ellis later identified as ancient Hebrew, a language Pat, a high school graduate with no formal study, could not possibly know. He sprinkled holy water and began a prayer of protection, but Pat's head snapped up, her eyes locking onto his. "You cannot bind what the Lord himself has named," she hissed, her voice layered, as if two beings spoke at once. The name Leviathan echoed again, chilling the room. As an exorcist, I've learned that demons reveal themselves to intimidate, to sow fear. Leviathan, as described in the book of Job, chapter 41, is no ordinary spirit. God himself calls it a creature of unmatched power, a serpent of the sea, whose scales defy any human weapon, whose eyes burn like the dawn. It is chaos incarnate, a rebel against divine order. When my colleague shared this story, he emphasized that Bishop Ellis felt the weight of that scripture in that moment. Pat wasn't just ill, she was a battleground for something ancient, something that had waited centuries to rise again. The dogs howled louder that night, their cries circling the farm like a noose tightening. Frank stood watch by the barn, a shotgun in hand, though he knew bullets were useless against what they faced. Tommy clung to his mother's side, whispering prayers he'd learned in Sunday school, his small voice trembling. Pat, clutching the seashell, stared out the window toward Bantam Lake, her face pale, her lips moving in silent conversation with something unseen. Bishop Ellis promised to return, but he warned Frank this was only the beginning. The reading family was about to face a force that had defied humanity since the days of Job, a force that would test their faith, their love, and their very survival. The morning after Bishop Robert Ellis's first visit to the Redding farm, the air felt thicker, as if the world itself held its breath. Pat had barely slept, her eyes bloodshot, her hands trembling as she clutched the seashell. Frank noticed she hadn't eaten breakfast, her coffee untouched on the kitchen table. Tommy, usually talkative, was quiet, drawing pictures of the lake with jagged black waves. The dogs, which had haunted the farm's perimeter for nights, were silent now, but their absence was no comfort. Frank checked the livestock pens and found fresh claw marks on the wooden fence, too deep for coyotes, too erratic for any animal he knew. He didn't tell Pat, not wanting to add to her distress, but he felt the weight of something unnatural pressing on the farm. Bishop Ellis returned that afternoon, his face stern but resolute. He brought with him Father Michael Dunn, a younger priest from a neighboring parish, trained in the rites of spiritual warfare. The two men entered the farmhouse carrying holy water, a crucifix, and a leather-bound copy of the Roman Ritual. Pat sat in the living room, the seashell on her lap, her gaze fixed on the floor. When Bishop Ellis began a prayer of blessing, Pat's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. "You waste your words," she said, her voice low and guttural, not her own. "The sea does not kneel to your God." The room grew cold, the windows rattling, though no wind stirred outside. Father Dunn, new to such encounters, gripped his rosary tightly, his knuckles white. Bishop Ellis, undeterred, sprinkled holy water toward Pat. She recoiled, her body jerking as if burned, and let out a scream that echoed with two voices, one human, one otherworldly. The seashell fell to the floor, and as it hit, a low rumble shook the house like distant thunder. Frank, standing by the door, saw water seeping from the floorboards near Pat's feet, though no pipes ran beneath that part of the house. It wasn't much a thin trickle, but it smelled of salt, like the ocean, and it pooled around Pat's chair in a perfect circle. Bishop Ellis recognized the signs immediately. This was no ordinary haunting. Leviathan, the creature described in Job chapter 41 as untamable by man, was manifesting its power. As an exorcist, I've learned that demons thrive on fear and division. They reveal themselves not just to terrify, but to break the will of those who resist. My colleague told me that Bishop Ellis felt this truth keenly that day. He ordered Frank to take Tommy outside, away from the room's oppressive air. Frank hesitated, torn between protecting his son and staying with his wife, but he obeyed, leading Tommy to the porch. The boy clung to his father, whispering, "Why is Mommy so angry?" Frank had no answer, only a growing dread that their lives were unraveling. The priests began a minor rite of exorcism, a preliminary step to assess the depth of the possession. They recited prayers in Latin, invoking the name of Christ and the Virgin Mary. Pat's reaction was immediate and violent. She lunged from her chair, knocking Father Dunn to the ground. Her nails raked his arm, leaving deep scratches that bled through his shirt. Bishop Ellis grabbed her shoulders, praying louder, but Pat's strength was unnatural. She shoved him against the wall, her eyes gleaming with malice. "Leviathan will drown you all," she snarled, her voice layered with that same unearthly tone. The priest restrained her, barely, and tied her to the chair with a rope from the barn, a temporary measure to keep her from harming herself or others. When the rite ended, Pat slumped, exhausted, her body trembling. The water around her chair had vanished, leaving only a faint salty residue on the floor. Bishop Ellis, his arm bruised from the struggle, knew they were dealing with something ancient and powerful. He sent Father Dunn to the hospital for stitches 8, to be exact, and told Frank they needed to prepare for a full exorcism. "This is not a sickness of the body," he said. "It's a battle for her soul." End the verse. Frank, desperate for answers, began searching for clues about the seashell. He called a local historian, Margaret Hale, who knew the history of Bantam Lake. Margaret visited the farm the next day, examining the shell with gloved hands. She recognized the carving immediately, a serpent around a scepter, a symbol tied to ancient maritime cults. She told Frank about a shipwreck from the 18th century, discovered in the lake's sediment years ago. Local legends spoke of fishermen who, desperate for bountiful catches, performed rituals to summon a sea spirit. The shell, Margaret believed, was a relic from those rites, possibly a conduit for something malevolent. "You need to get rid of it," she warned. But when Frank tried to take the shell from Pat, she screamed, clutching it to her chest as if it were part of her. That night, the chaos escalated. The dogs returned, but this time they didn't just bark, they attacked. 2 of the family's cows were found dead in the pasture, their throats torn open, their bodies surrounded by paw prints too large for any stray. Frank stood over the carcasses, his shotgun useless, his heart pounding. He looked toward Bantam Lake, its surface rippling under the moonlight, though no breeze stirred the air. The water seemed alive, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the pounding in his chest. Bats condition versend. She stopped sleeping, pacing the farmhouse at night, muttering in that strange language. Tommy, terrified, began sleeping in Frank's room, clutching a small crucifix his grandmother had given him. The bruises on Pat's body spread, the scale-like patterns now covering her arms and neck. She refused to eat, but drank water obsessively, gulping it down as if parched, only to spit it out moments later, claiming it tasted of salt. Frank, at his wit's end, called Dr. Jenkins again, hoping for a medical explanation. The doctor, shaken by his last visit, suggested a psychiatrist, but Frank refused. "This isn't in her head," he said. "It's something else." Bishop Ellis, meanwhile, consulted with the diocese, seeking permission for a formal exorcism. He also reached out to a colleague, Father Joseph Carney, who had experience with maritime legends. Father Carney shared a chilling detail. The shell's carving matched descriptions of artifacts linked to Leviathan, a demon not just of chaos but of rebellion against God's order. In the book of Job, God describes Leviathan as a creature whose power mocks human strength, a being that laughs at spears and swords. Father Carney warned that if Leviathan had chosen Pat, it was because it sensed a vulnerability, a crack in her spirit, perhaps her quiet frustration with the monotony of farm life. By the end of the week, the farm was a place of fear. The dogs circled closer each night, their eyes glinting in the dark. The lake's ripples grew into waves, lapping at the shore, even on still nights. Pat's outbursts became more frequent, her voice alternating between her own and that otherworldly growl. One evening, as Frank tucked Tommy into bed, Pat appeared in the doorway, the seashell in her hand. "The sea is coming," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the lake outside. Tommy whimpered, and Frank pulled him close, praying for strength he wasn't sure he had. "As an exorcist, I know the devil works by isolating his victims, turning families against each other. My colleague told me that Frank felt this acutely torn between protecting his son and saving his wife, unsure if either was possible. Bishop Ellis, preparing for the exorcism, warned Frank that the battle ahead would test their faith. Leviathan is not just a demon, he said. It's a force that seeks to drown all that is good." The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the Redding family to its core, a fight not just for Pat's soul, but for the very ground they stood on. With Bishop Robert Ellis preparing for a formal exorcism, the Redding farm felt like a place forsaken. The air carried a briny tang, as if the ocean itself had crept inland, though Bantam Lake lay miles from any sea. Frank, exhausted from sleepless nights, kept a vigilant watch over Pat, who now rarely spoke in her own voice. Her outbursts came without warning. One moment she was quiet, the next she'd scream words in that strange, guttural tongue, her eyes gleaming with a malice that wasn't hers. Tommy, only 8, stopped going to school, too afraid to leave his mother's side, though he flinched whenever she looked at him. The scale-like bruises on her skin had spread to her face, faint but unmistakable, glinting under lamplight like wet fish scales. Bishop Ellis, joined by Father Michael Dunn, returned to the farm with a renewed sense of purpose. They met Frank in the kitchen, where the seashell sat on the table, its carved serpent seeming to pulse in the dim light. The bishop explained that the diocese had approved a series of exorcisms, but the process would be grueling. "Leviathan is not a common demon," he said, his voice steady but grave. "It's a primordial force, described in the book of Job as a creature that laughs at man's attempts to bind it. We must rely on Christ's authority alone." Frank nodded, clutching a rosary he hadn't touched in years, his calloused hands trembling. The first formal exorcism began in the farmhouse's living room, cleared of furniture except for a wooden chair where Pat was seated. She was restrained with soft ropes, not to harm her but to protect everyone present. Father Dunn sprinkled holy water around the room, while Bishop Ellis began the rite of exorcism, reciting prayers in Latin, "Exorcizo te immundissime spiritus." Pat's reaction was immediate. Her body arched violently, the ropes straining against her wrists. She spat water salty, as if drawn from the sea, and her voice roared, "You cannot cage the deep." The words echoed with a power that rattled the windows, and a low hum filled the air, like the sound of waves crashing far away. Outside, the farm seemed to respond to the ritual. The dogs, silent for days, returned with a vengeance, their howls rising in a chorus that seemed to come from every direction. Frank, standing guard on the porch with Tommy, saw the lake's surface churn, waves breaking against the shore, though the night was still. He gripped his son's hand, whispering prayers he barely remembered, his heart pounding as the howls grew louder. Inside, Pat's body convulsed, her head twisting at unnatural angles. She spoke in that layered voice, mocking the priest, "Your God bound me once, but I rise again." Bishop Ellis pressed on, holding a crucifix before her, but Pat's eyes locked onto it, and the metal grew hot in his hand, forcing him to drop it. The first rite ended after hours of struggle, leaving everyone drained. Pat slumped in the chair, her breathing shallow, her face pale. The priest untied her, and Frank carried her to bed, her body limp as if the fight had sapped her strength, but the signs didn't stop. That night a storm rolled in without warning, rain pounding the farm with such force that the fields turned to mud. Lightning illuminated the lake, revealing shapes beneath the water shadows that seemed to writhe before vanishing. Frank, checking the barn, found the remaining livestock trembling, their eyes wide with fear. He didn't sleep, sitting by Pat's bedside with a Bible, reading Psalms aloud, hoping to keep the darkness at bay. Desperate for answers, Frank contacted Dr. Laura Simmons, a local ecologist who'd studied Bantam Lake. Laura, a skeptic by nature, arrived the next day, her curiosity piqued by Margaret Hale's earlier findings about the seashell. She examined the lake's edge, noting its unnatural behavior, tides forming where none should exist, water samples showing traces of salt impossible for a freshwater lake. She also studied the seashell using a magnifying glass to inspect its carving. "This isn't just a relic," she told Frank. "It's a ritual object, likely from a cult that worships sea deities." The shipwreck Margaret mentioned, it wasn't just fishermen. They were invoking something they couldn't control. Laura's voice shook as she spoke, her scientific mind wrestling with the impossible. During her inspection, Laura ventured too close to the lake's shore. Pat, who'd been silent all morning, appeared suddenly, her movements jerky, like a puppet on strings. Before Frank could react, Pat grabbed Laura's arm and shoved her into the water. Laura thrashed, gasping, as an unseen force seemed to pull her under. Frank dove in, pulling her to safety, but not before she struck her knee on a rock, blood mixing with the lake's ripples. Laura, shivering on the shore, swore she heard a voice beneath the water whispering her name. Frank carried her back to the farmhouse, his clothes soaked, his mind reeling. Pat stood by the lake, staring into its depths, the seashell clutched in her hand. Laura, shaken but determined, returned the next day with a discovery. In the town library, she'd found a journal from the 1800s written by a priest who'd served near Bantam Lake. The journal described a similar incident. A fisherman had found a carved shell, fallen ill, and spoken of a sea serpent promising power. The priest had performed an exorcism, driving the spirit out, but the journal ended with a warning. The beast demands a sacrifice. It will return through any who touch its mark. Laura showed Frank the passage, her hands trembling. "This thing, Leviathan, it's been here before," she said. "The shell is its anchor." The exorcisms continued, each one more intense. By the third rite, Pat's reactions grew terrifying. She levitated inches off the chair, her body twisting as if caught in an invisible current. She spoke in languages no one recognized, her words interspersed with growls that sounded like the sea itself. The farmhouse shook during these sessions, dishes rattling in the cupboards, and once a crack appeared in the living room wall, oozing salt water. Tommy, kept away from the rites, began having nightmares of his own, waking up screaming about a snake in the water. Frank, torn between fear and duty, started attending church daily, praying for strength to hold his family together. As an exorcist, I know that demons exploit human weaknesses, doubt, anger, despair. My colleague told me that Leviathan had chosen Pat not just because of the seashell, but because it sensed her inner turmoil. She loved her family, but the grind of farm life, the endless cycle of chores, had left her feeling trapped. Leviathan used that crack in her spirit to take hold, promising freedom while binding her tighter. Bishop Ellis, aware of this, urged Frank to stay close to Pat to remind her of her love for him and Tommy. "Faith and love are our weapons," he said. "Leviathan wants to break those bonds." By late summer, the farm was a shadow of itself. Crops wilted under the unseasonable storms, and the livestock grew skittish, refusing to graze near the lake. The dogs' howls became a nightly torment, their shadows darting through the fields like specters. Pat's health deteriorated. She lost weight, her skin pale except for the scale-like marks, and she refused all food but water, which she drank in gulps, only to retch it up moments later. Frank, Laura, and the priest formed a fragile alliance, united by their determination to save Pat, though each faced their own fears. The lake, once a peaceful backdrop, now loomed like a living entity, its waves whispering secrets only Pat seemed to hear. By the fall of 1983, the Reading Farm was a place of desolation. The fields, once green with corn and wheat, lay sodden under relentless rain, the crops rotting in the mud. The livestock, what little remained after the dogs' attacks, huddled in the barn, their lowing filled with fear. Bantam Lake, just a quarter-mile from the farmhouse, had become a source of dread. Its waters churned at night, casting eerie reflections of moonlight that seemed to form shapes, coiled serpentine forms that vanished when stared at too long. Pat, now barely recognizable, spent her days in a trance-like state, clutching the seashell and staring toward the lake. Her voice, when she spoke, was rarely her own, alternating between whispers and that guttural, otherworldly growl that named Leviathan. Bishop Robert Ellis, joined by Father Michael Dunn, pressed on with the exorcisms, now in their 5th and 6th sessions. Each rite was a grueling ordeal, lasting hours and leaving the priests physically and spiritually drained. They performed the rituals in the farmhouse's dining room, where a heavy oak table had been pushed aside to make room for a chair where Pat was restrained. The air grew heavy during these sessions, thick with the scent of saltwater, though no ocean was near. Pat's reactions grew more violent with each rite. During the 5th exorcism, she broke one of the ropes binding her wrists, her fingers clawing at the air as if trying to grasp something unseen. Her voice roared, "The deep will swallow your prayers," and the room shook, a low rumble rising from the floorboards as if the earth itself protested. Father Dunn, still bearing the scars from Pat's earlier attack, began to falter. His faith was strong, but the relentless assaults of Leviathan tested his courage. During the 6th rite, as Bishop Ellis recited the Litany of the Saints, Pat's head twisted sharply, her eyes locking onto Dunn. "You are weak," she hissed, her voice layered with malice. "The sea knows your doubts." Dunn stumbled over his prayers, his hands trembling, and Bishop Ellis had to take his arm, steadying him with a firm look. As an exorcist, I've learned that demons target the vulnerable, seeking to exploit any crack in resolve. My colleague told me that Dunn's fear was palpable that day, a reminder that even priests are human in the face of such evil. Frank, meanwhile, was fighting his own battle. He had taken to sleeping in a chair by Pat's bedside, a shotgun across his lap, though he knew it was useless against the force they faced. Tommy, now withdrawn and pale, spent his days drawing endless sketches of the lake, each one darker, with jagged waves and a shadowy serpent lurking beneath. Frank tried to shield his son, sending him to stay with a neighbor during the exorcisms, but Tommy refused to leave, clinging to the hope that his mother could be saved. One evening, as Frank read to Tommy from a children's Bible, the boy pointed to a passage in Psalms. "You rule the raging of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them." Tommy looked up, his eyes wide. "Can God stop the snake, Daddy?" Frank, choking back tears, said, "He has to, son. He has to." Desperate for any advantage, Frank turned to Laura Simmons, the ecologist who had narrowly escaped drowning at Pat's hands. Laura, though shaken, had become invested in the family's plight. She returned to the farm with a stack of research, her scientific skepticism eroded by what she'd witnessed. She'd spent days in the town library, cross-referencing the journals she'd found with other historical records. She discovered a chilling detail. The 18th century fishermen who'd summoned Leviathan had paid a price. Their village had prospered briefly, their nets overflowing with fish, but within a year, storms ravaged their homes, and several men vanished into the lake, their bodies never found. The journal's priests had warned that Leviathan demanded a tribute, a life given willingly or taken by force to sate its hunger. Laura shared this with Frank and Bishop Ellis, her voice steady despite her fear. "The shell is a conduit," she said. "It's not just an object, it's a doorway. As long as Pat holds it, Leviathan has a hold on her." Frank, his face haggard, tried to take the shell from Pat that night. She was sitting in the living room, staring at the lake through the window. When he reached for the shell, her hand shot out, gripping his wrist with unnatural strength. "It's mine," she growled, her voice not her own. "The sea gave it to me." Frank backed away, his heart pounding, realizing that separating Pat from the shell might be impossible without risking her life. The exorcisms continued, each one marked by new horrors. During the seventh rite, Pat's body levitated a full foot off the chair, her limbs twisting as if caught in an invisible tide. She spoke in a language that Father Dunn later identified as Aramaic, a tongue dead for centuries. The words were curses, promises of destruction, and taunts aimed at the priest's faith. The farmhouse responded as if alive windows cracked. The chandelier swung wildly, and a torrent of salt water poured from the ceiling, soaking the room. Bishop Ellis pressed on, his voice unwavering, but the strain was evident. His hand shook as he held the crucifix, and his prayers grew hoarse. Outside, the farm was no longer a sanctuary. The dogs, now a constant presence, grew bolder, their eyes glowing in the dark as they circled the house. One night, Frank found a sheep gutted in the pasture, its blood forming a pattern that mirrored the serpent carving on the shell. He buried it before Tommy could see, but the image haunted him. The lake's behavior grew stranger, its waters turned murky, and fishermen reported their nets tangling on unseen objects below. One man swore he saw a massive shape move beneath the surface, its scales catching the moonlight before it sank. Laura, determined to help, began attending the exorcisms, though she stayed at a distance, clutching a cross she'd borrowed from Frank. During the eighth rite, Pat's gaze fixed on her, and she spoke in that layered voice. "The sea remembers you, woman." It tasted your fear. Laura froze, her mind flashing back to her near drowning. She wanted to run but stayed, praying silently, her scientific training useless against the reality before her. Bishop Ellis noticed her resolve and nodded, a silent acknowledgement of her courage. As an exorcist, I know that such moments, when ordinary people stand firm against evil, are as powerful as any prayer. By winter, the farm was a shadow of itself. The fields were barren, the barn half empty, and the farmhouse creaked under the weight of constant storms. Pat's condition was dire. She hadn't eaten solid food in weeks, surviving on water that she drank obsessively, only to vomit it up, claiming it burned her throat. The scale-like marks now covered her torso, visible through her thin nightgown, and her eyes had a glassy, distant look. Frank, Laura, and the priests formed a fragile coalition, bound by their shared mission to save Pat, but the toll was evident. Frank's hands were raw from gripping his rosary. Laura's sleep was plagued by nightmares of drowning, and Father Dunn's faith wavered, though he hid it behind a stoic facade. Bishop Ellis, preparing for the ninth exorcism, confided in Frank that Leviathan was unlike any demon he'd faced. "It's not just possessing her," he said. "It's trying to remake her, to make her a vessel for its chaos." He cited the book of Job, where God describes Leviathan's scales as shields, its breath as fire, its heart as hard as stone. "We're fighting something that believes it can defy God himself," he said. Frank, clinging to hope, asked if Pat could be saved. Ellis paused, then said, "With faith, all things are possible, but we must be ready for a cost." The stage was set for a battle that would push the Redding family and their allies to the edge. Leviathan, sensing their determination, tightened its grip, its presence felt in every wave, every howl, every shadow that moved across the farm. The lake waited, its secrets buried deep, and Pat, trapped in its grasp, was running out of time. By the winter of 1983, the Redding farm was a husk of its former self. The fields lay barren, drowned by relentless storms that seemed to rise from nowhere, leaving the soil too sodden for planting. The barn, once filled with the lowing of cattle, was nearly empty, the remaining animals skittish and thin. Bantam Lake, a quarter-mile from the farmhouse, had become a source of fear for the entire community. Fishermen avoided it, whispering of nets torn by unseen forces and shadows moving beneath the surface, too large to be fish. At night, the lake's waves crashed against the shore with a rhythm that felt deliberate, almost mocking, as if the water itself were alive with malice. Pat's condition had worsened to a point that chilled even the most steadfast. Her body, once strong from years of farm work, was frail, her skin pale and stretched tight over her bones. The scale-like bruises that marked her arms, legs, and torso now pulsed faintly as if alive, their patterns shifting under candlelight. She no longer ate, surviving on sips of water that she drank compulsively, only to retch moments later, claiming it tasted of blood and salt. Her eyes, once warm and brown, were glassy, their pupils dilated to black pools that seemed to reflect the lake outside. She rarely spoke as herself, her voice replaced by that guttural, layered tone that named Leviathan and promised destruction. Bishop Robert Ellis, now leading the 9th exorcism, was a man under siege. His face was drawn, his eyes shadowed from sleepless nights, and the weight of battling a demon that seemed to grow stronger with each rite. Father Michael Dunn, his assistant, struggled to keep his composure. His earlier wounds scratches from Pat's unnatural strength, still bandaged and sore. The priest conducted the rituals in the farmhouse's dining room, where a heavy crucifix hung on the wall, its presence a silent challenge to the evil they faced. Pat was restrained in a chair, her wrists and ankles bound with soft ropes, though they barely held against her convulsions. The seashell, which she refused to release, lay in her lap, its carved serpent gleaming as if wet. The 9th exorcism began on a cold December evening, the air thick with the scent of impending snow. Bishop Ellis, clad in a purple stole, began the rite of exorcism, his voice steady as he invoked the name of Christ. Ego te absolvo in nomine Patris. Pat's reaction was immediate and ferocious. Her body arched, her spine bending at an impossible angle, and she let out a scream that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. The room trembled, the floorboards creaking as if under pressure, and a gust of wind, salty and cold, blew through the closed windows, extinguishing the candles. Father Dunn, clutching his rosary, began the litany of the saints, but Pat's voice cut through his words. Your chants are dust before the sea. The words were not hers, but Leviathan's, delivered with a venom that made the air feel heavy. Outside, the farm responded to the ritual's intensity. The dogs, which had terrorized the fields for months, gathered closer, their howls rising into a cacophony that drowned out the priest's prayers. Frank, standing on the porch with Tommy, saw the lake's surface boil, waves crashing against the shore with such force that pebbles scattered across the grass. Tommy, clutching his father's hand, whispered, "It's angry, Daddy. The snake is angry." Frank, his heart breaking, pulled his son close, murmuring a prayer he'd learned as a child. Hail Mary, full of grace. He felt powerless, a farmer, facing a force beyond his understanding, but he refused to abandon hope. Inside, the exorcism grew more chaotic. Pat's body levitated, not just inches, but nearly 2 feet off the chair, her limbs twisting as if caught in an invisible current. She spoke in a tongue that Bishop Ellis later identified as a mix of Hebrew and Aramaic languages she had no reason to know. The words were curses, threats of drowning, and taunts aimed at the priest's faith. Your God chained me once, but I am free. The seashell in her lap began to glow faintly, its carving pulsing with a rhythm that matched the lake's waves. Bishop Ellis, undeterred, held a crucifix before her, but Pat's eyes fixed on it, and the wood splintered in his hand, forcing him to drop it. Father Dunn gasped, his faith shaken, but Ellis pressed on, his voice rising above the chaos. By the power of Christ, I command you to leave this woman. The rite ended after 4 hours, leaving Pat slumped and silent, her breathing ragged. The priest, drenched in sweat, untied her and laid her on a couch. Frank carried her to bed, his arms trembling from exhaustion and fear. The room was a mess, candles overturned, water pooling on the floor, the air thick with the stench of brine. Bishop Ellis, his hands blistered from gripping the splintered crucifix, told Frank they needed help beyond the diocese. He contacted Father Joseph Carney, a priest with knowledge of ancient maritime cults, who arrived the next day. Father Carney examined the seashell, his face grim. This is no mere relic, he said. It's a vessel for Leviathan's will, tied to rituals that predate Christianity. The fishermen who carved it invited a power they couldn't control. Father Carney shared a story from his studies in Rome, a similar case in a coastal village, where a fisherman had found a carved stone and fallen under a demon's sway. The exorcism had succeeded, but only after a sacrifice, a life given to appease the spirit. Carney warned that Leviathan, as described in Job chapter 41, was a creature of unmatched pride, its scales like shields, its heart unyielding. It will not leave easily, he said. It demands a price. Frank, overhearing, felt a chill. He looked at Pat sleeping fitfully and vowed to pay any price to save her. The community around Litchfield began to take notice. Neighbors, once friendly, kept their distance, whispering of curses and haunted waters. The local newspaper ran a story about the lake's strange behavior, though it avoided mention of the readings. Laura Simmons, the ecologist, continued her research, driven by a mix of fear and determination. She found a second journal in the town archives, written by a merchant who traded with the 18th century fishermen. It described a ritual where blood was spilled into the lake to feed the serpent, ensuring bountiful catches. The merchant had fled the village after seeing a man dragged into the water by an unseen force. Laura shared this with Frank, her voice shaking. "This thing, it's been waiting for centuries," she said. The shell woke it up. During the 10th exorcism, the demon's power peaked. Pat's body convulsed so violently that the chair splintered beneath her. She spoke in multiple voices, some weeping, others laughing, all promising chaos. The farmhouse shook, a crack forming in the ceiling, and saltwater poured down, soaking the priest's vestments. Tommy, who'd snuck into the room against Frank's orders, ran to his mother, crying, "Mommy, come back!" A force threw him back, his arm snapping as he hit the wall. Frank rushed to him, sobbing, as Laura bandaged the boy's arm with a towel. The priest stopped the rite, shaken by the violence. Tommy, in pain but defiant, whispered, "I want Mommy to be okay." His courage, my colleague told me, was a light in the darkness, a reminder of why they fought. As an exorcist, I know that demons thrive on despair, but they fear the love that binds families. Leviathan was exploiting Pat's hidden frustrations, her weariness with farm life, her unspoken longing for something more. Yet her love for Frank and Tommy remained, a tether the demon couldn't break. Bishop Ellis, regrouping with Father Carney and Father Dunn, planned the next rites with renewed resolve. They knew the battle was far from over, and the lake, pulsing with Leviathan's presence, loomed as a constant threat. The Redding family, battered but unbroken, stood on the edge of a war that would demand everything they had. The winter of 1983 brought a bitter cold to Litchfield, the kind that seeped into bones and lingered in the air. The Redding farm, already battered by months of chaos, seemed to groan under the weight of the season. The fields were a frozen mire, the barn's roof sagged under snow, and the remaining livestock, 2 horses and a handful of chickens, shivered in their stalls, refusing to venture near the pasture. Bantam Lake, a quarter-mile away, was no longer just a body of water. It was a presence, its surface glinting under the moonlight with an unnatural sheen, as if coated in oil. At night, the waves didn't just lap at the shore, they roared, their rhythm echoing the growls that came from Pat's throat when the demon spoke. Pat was a shadow of the woman she'd been. Her body, frail and gaunt, moved with an eerie purpose, as if guided by something other than her own will. The scale-like marks on her skin had spread to her neck and face, their patterns shifting like ripples on water. She no longer slept, spending her nights pacing the farmhouse, her bare feet leaving wet footprints that smelled of salt. Her hands clung to the seashell, its carved serpent now warm to the touch, as if alive. When she spoke, it was rarely as pat. Her voice was a chorus of whispers and snarls, promising floods and ruin. Frank, haunted by Tommy's broken arm, kept a constant vigil, his eyes bloodshot from sleeplessness, his faith strained but unbroken. Bishop Robert Ellis, joined by Father Michael Dunn and Father Joseph Carney, pressed on with the 11th exorcism. The dining room, their makeshift sanctuary, was a place of stark contrasts, a heavy crucifix on the wall, its shadow flickering in candlelight, and the seashell in Pat's lap, its glow casting an unholy light. The priests wore purple stoles, their faces etched with determination, though the strain was evident. Father Dunn, still shaken from Tommy's injury, struggled to keep his voice steady as he recited prayers. Father Carney, with his knowledge of ancient cults, brought a new intensity, his eyes scanning Pat for signs of the demon's intent. Bishop Ellis, the anchor of the group, led the rite of exorcism with a voice that carried the weight of years spent battling evil. Domine, exaudi orationem meum. Pat's reaction was unlike anything they'd seen. As the prayers began, her body convulsed, not just with spasms, but with a fluid motion, as if she were underwater, her limbs swaying like seaweed in a current. Her mouth opened, and a torrent of salt water poured out, not a trickle, but a flood that soaked the floor, its briny stench filling the room. The seashell pulsed brighter, its carving seeming to writhe. "You cannot hold the tide," she roared, her voice a blend of human and inhuman tones, shaking the walls. The crucifix on the wall tilted, then fell, landing in the pooling water with a splash. Father Dunn flinched, but Father Carney grabbed his arm, whispering, "Stay strong, it wants your fear." Outside, the farm was under siege. The dogs, which had haunted the fields for months, now pressed against the farmhouse, their howls a deafening chorus that seemed to echo from the lake itself. Frank, guarding the porch with a flashlight, saw their eyes glowing in the dark, not like animals but like lanterns, their shapes distorted in the snow. The lake's waves crashed harder, sending sprays of water that froze into jagged patterns on the shore. Tommy, confined to his room with a splint on his arm, drew feverishly pictures of a serpent coiling around the farmhouse, its jaws open wide. Frank found one sketch under Tommy's pillow, the words "Help Mommy" scrawled in crayon, and his heart broke anew. Laura Simmons, the ecologist who had joined the fight, was now a regular at the exorcisms, her skepticism replaced by a grim resolve. She brought new findings from her research, digging deeper into the history of Bantam Lake. In a forgotten archive, she'd uncovered a letter from a missionary in the 1700s describing a ritual where fishermen offered blood to a sea spirit for prosperity. The missionary had tried to stop them, but the lake had turned red, and the village was abandoned soon after. Laura shared this with Frank and the priest, her voice low. "Leviathan isn't just a demon," she said. "It's a force that feeds on chaos. The shell is its key, but it's chosen Pat because of her pain." Frank, hearing this, felt a stab of guilt. He knew Pat had struggled with the monotony of farm life, though she'd never spoken it aloud. During the 12th exorcism, the demon's power surged. Pat's body lifted from the chair, not just levitating, but spinning slowly, her head tilted back as if gazing into an abyss. She spoke in a language that Father Carney recognized as ancient Phoenician, a tongue tied to seafaring cults. The words were a chant, rhythmic and hypnotic, promising a flood to drown the world. The farmhouse responded, pipes groaned, though none ran through the dining room, and salt water seeped from the walls, forming pools that reflected the candlelight like mirrors. The priest's prayers grew louder, but Pat's voice drowned them out. "The sea will rise, and your God will kneel." Bishop Ellis, his face pale but resolute, held a relic, a fragment of the true cross before her, but the relic grew cold, frosting over in his hand. The ritual ended in chaos. Pat collapsed, her body hitting the floor with a thud, the seashell rolling away. Frank rushed to her, checking her pulse, his hands shaking. She was alive, but barely, her breathing shallow. The priests, exhausted, retreated to pray, their vestments soaked with salt water. Laura, shaken, noticed something new. The seashell lying in a corner was cracked, a hairline fracture running through the serpent's coils. She pointed it out to Bishop Ellis, who saw it as a sign Leviathan was weakening, but at a cost. "It's fighting harder because it knows we're close," he said, "but it will demand more before it leaves." Frank, desperate to protect his family, began searching the farmhouse for clues. In the attic, he found a box of old family letters, one from Pat's great-grandmother, a devout woman who'd lived on the farm. The letter spoke of a darkness in the lake, warning her descendants to avoid its shores. Frank realized the farm's history was tied to the lake's curse, a legacy Pat had unknowingly inherited. He shared this with Laura, who cross-referenced it with her findings. The letter hinted at a ritual to seal the demon away, but it required a sacrifice, not just blood, but a willing act of love. Frank, reading this, felt a chill, his mind racing with what it might mean. The community, once distant, began to rally in small ways. A neighbor, Mrs. Clara Evans, brought meals to the farm, though she never stayed long, her eyes darting to the lake. The local church held prayer vigils, though few mentioned the readings by name, fearing the stigma of possession. Tommy, despite his injury, insisted on helping, drawing crosses on paper and taping them to the farmhouse windows. His faith, simple but fierce, moved Frank to tears. "Mommy's still in there," Tommy said, his voice steady despite his pain. "We just have to find her." As an exorcist, I know that demons like Leviathan thrive on breaking bonds between families, between souls and God. My colleague told me that Frank's love for Pat and Tommy was a bulwark against this evil, a light that Leviathan feared. Bishop Ellis, preparing for the 13th exorcism, urged the group to focus on this love. "Leviathan wants us divided," he said. "We must stand together in faith and sacrifice." The lake, now a mirror of the demon's rage, churned louder, its waves a constant reminder of the battle ahead. The reading family, battered but resolute, faced a war that would demand everything they had, with the seashell's crack a faint hope in a sea of despair. The winter of 1983 was merciless, blanketing Litchfield in snow that seemed to carry a weight beyond the cold. The reading farm was a frozen wasteland, its fields buried under drifts, the barn creaking under the strain of ice. The few remaining animals, 2 horses and a single cow, huddled in their stalls, their breath visible in the frigid air. Bantam Lake, a quarter-mile from the farmhouse, was no longer just a body of water. It was a living entity, its surface half frozen but pulsing with unnatural warmth. Steam rising from cracks in the ice. At night, the lake groaned, its waves breaking through the frost with a sound like cracking bones, as if Leviathan itself stirred beneath. Pat was barely human, her body, emaciated and pale, moved with a jerky precision, like a marionette controlled by unseen strings. The scale-like marks on her skin now glowed faintly, their patterns shifting like waves caught in moonlight. She hadn't spoken as herself in weeks, her voice replaced by a chorus of growls and whispers that named Leviathan and promised a deluge to drown the world. The seashell, its crack now wider, remained in her grasp, its carved serpent seeming to writhe under her touch. Frank, his face etched with exhaustion, stayed by her side, his hands raw from clutching a rosary, his heart torn between hope and despair. Bishop Robert Ellis, joined by Father Michael Dunn and Father Joseph Carney, prepared for the 13th exorcism with a grim resolve. The dining room, their battleground, was a place of stark desolation. A single crucifix on the wall, its wood worn from months of strain, and a circle of candles casting flickering shadows. Pat was restrained in a chair, her wrists and ankles bound with ropes that bore the marks of her struggles. The priests, their faces haggard, wore purple stoles, their prayers a lifeline against the darkness. Father Dunn, his faith tested by Pat's violence, whispered the Salve Regina under his breath, seeking strength. Father Carney, his knowledge of ancient cults a guiding light, watched Pat closely, noting the seashell's growing fracture. Bishop Ellis, the anchor, began the rite of exorcism, his voice steady despite the toll. Exorcizo te omnis spiritus immunde. Pat's reaction was cataclysmic. Her body lifted from the chair, not just levitating, but thrashing, as if caught in a storm's current. Her mouth opened, and a sound emerged, not a scream, but a roar, like the sea crashing against cliffs. Saltwater sprayed from her lips, soaking the priests and extinguishing the candles. The seashell glowed brighter, its crack emitting a faint hum that vibrated through the room. "You cannot bind what the deep has claimed," she bellowed, her voice a blend of human anguish and demonic triumph. The farmhouse shook, the walls creaking, and a torrent of salt water poured from the ceiling, pooling around the chair in swirling patterns that mirrored the shell's carving. Outside, the farm was a chaos of its own. The dogs, their numbers seemingly endless, pressed against the house, their howls merging with the lake's groans to form a deafening cacophony. Frank, standing on the porch with Tommy, saw the lake's ice crack, steam rising in plumes as waves surged beneath. Tommy, his arm still in a splint, clutched a small cross he'd carved from wood, his eyes wide with fear. "It's coming, Daddy," he whispered. "The snake wants us all." Frank, his heart pounding, held his son close, praying the Our Father, his voice trembling but resolute. The snow around the farmhouse melted in patches, forming pools that smelled of brine, as if the ocean itself were seeping into the land. Laura Simmons, the ecologist who had become an unlikely ally, stood with the priests, her scientific mind grappling with the supernatural. She'd spent nights poring over texts, uncovering fragments of lore about Leviathan. She found a reference in a medieval manuscript describing a ritual to banish a sea demon by destroying its anchor, a relic like the seashell. But the text warned of a cost. The demon would not leave without a gift of life, freely given. Laura shared this with Frank, her voice low. "The shell is its power," she said. "If we destroy it, we might free Pat, but Leviathan won't go quietly." Frank, his eyes haunted, nodded, his mind racing with the implications. He looked at Pat, her body twisting in the chair, and felt a resolve harden within him he would do whatever it took. During the 14th exorcism, the demon's resistance reached a new height. Pat's body spun in the air, her limbs contorting as if pulled by invisible tides. She spoke in a tongue that Father Carney identified as ancient Akkadian, a language of Mesopotamian priests who worshipped sea gods. The words were a hymn praising the Lord of the deep who would flood the earth. The farmhouse responded, pipes burst, though none ran through the dining room, and saltwater flooded the floor, rising to the priest's ankles. The crucifix on the wall shattered, its fragments sinking into the water. Bishop Ellis, undeterred, held a vial of holy oil, anointing Pat's forehead, but her skin burned at the touch, leaving blisters that oozed brine. The ritual was cut short when Pat's body collapsed, her breathing ragged. Frank rushed to her, cradling her head, his tears mixing with the salt water on the floor. The seashell, now cracked nearly in half, lay beside her, its glow dimming. Bishop Ellis, his vestments soaked, saw the crack as a sign of progress, but warned the group, "Leviathan is weakening, but it's desperate. It will strike harder now." Father Dunn, his faith fraying, confessed his doubts to Father Carney, who placed a hand on his shoulder. "Doubt is human," Carney said, "but faith is our shield. As an exorcist, I know that such moments test even the strongest, and my colleague told me that Dunn's struggle was a reminder of the human cost of this battle." Frank, driven by desperation, began researching the farm's history, hoping to find a way to break the curse. In the basement, he found a hidden trunk containing a diary from Pat's great-grandfather, a farmer who'd lived on the land in the 1800s. The diary spoke of strange occurrences, a drought followed by floods, livestock vanishing, and a voice from the lake that drove a farmhand mad. The final entry described a ritual where the farmhand, in a fit of despair, threw himself into the lake, ending the disturbances. Frank, reading this, felt a chill. Was this the sacrifice Leviathan demanded? He hid the diary, unwilling to share its implications, but the weight of it gnawed at him. The community, though hesitant, began to offer support. Father Carney organized a prayer group at St. Anthony's, where parishioners gathered nightly, their candles flickering in the dark. Mrs. Clara Evans, the neighbor, left baskets of bread and soup at the farmhouse door, her notes inscribed with psalms. Tommy, despite his fear, began writing prayers for his mother, slipping them under her pillow when she slept. One read, "God, please send the snake away. I love Mommy." Frank found it and wept, his resolve strengthened by his son's faith. The 15th exorcism was a turning point. Pat's body no longer levitated, but seemed to dissolve into the water, pooling around her, her form flickering like a reflection. She spoke in a chorus of voices, some pleading, others mocking, all promising a flood to end all things. The seashell's crack widened, and a low hum filled the room, shaking the priest's bones. Bishop Ellis, his voice hoarse, recited the prayer of St. Michael, his hands trembling but firm. Laura, standing at the edge of the room, clutched a cross, her lips moving in silent prayer. The lake outside roared, its waves crashing through the ice, and the dog's howls became a scream as if the demon itself cried out. As an exorcist, I know that demons like Leviathan fear the power of united faith. My colleague told me that this moment when Frank, Tommy, Laura, and the priest stood together was a turning point. The seashell's crack was a sign that Leviathan's hold was slipping, But the demon's desperation meant the final battle would be fierce. The lake, now a mirror of Leviathan's rage, waited, its depths hiding a power that demanded a price. The Redding family, battered but unbroken, faced a reckoning that would test the very limits of love and sacrifice. The winter of 1985 was unrelenting, cloaking Litchfield in a frost so deep it seemed to mirror the despair that gripped the Redding farm. The fields were buried under snow, the barn's timbers groaned under ice, and the few remaining animals, a single horse and a handful of chickens, cowered in their stalls, as if sensing the evil that permeated the air. Bantam Lake, a quarter-mile from the farmhouse, was a frozen expanse, its ice cracked and steaming, as if the water beneath burned with an unnatural heat. The lake's groans had become a constant drone, a low, menacing hum that vibrated through the ground, felt in the bones of all who approached. The townsfolk, once curious, now shunned the lake, whispering of shadows beneath the ice and voices carried on the wind. Pat was a ghost of herself. Her body, skeletal and pale, moved with an eerie grace, as if guided by the tides of an invisible sea. The scale-like marks on her skin glowed with a sickly light, their patterns swirling like currents, and her eyes were vacant, black pools that seemed to hold the depths of the lake itself. She no longer spoke as Pat, her voice a cacophony of snarls and whispers that named Leviathan and promised a flood to end all things. The seashell, its crack now splitting the serpent's coils, was fused to her hands, its surface warm and pulsing. Frank, his face hollow from months of sleepless nights, clung to hope, his rosary worn smooth from constant prayer. Tommy, his arm still in a splint, drew crosses on every surface, his small voice whispering prayers for his mother's soul. Bishop Robert Ellis, joined by Father Michael Dunn and Father Joseph Carney, prepared for the 16th and final exorcism. The dining room, their battleground, was a place of stark desolation. A lone crucifix, scarred from months of strain, hung on the wall, and a circle of candles flickered weakly against the darkness. Pat was restrained in a chair, her wrists and ankles bound with ropes that bore the marks of her unnatural strength. The priests, their faces etched with exhaustion, wore purple stoles, their prayers a desperate plea for deliverance. Father Dunn, his faith battered but holding, clutched a rosary, his lips moving silently. Father Carney, his knowledge of ancient cults a guiding light, watched the seashell closely, its widening crack a sign of hope and danger. Bishop Ellis, his voice hoarse from months of battle, began the rite of exorcism. In nomine Jesu Christi, ego te expello. Pat's reaction was apocalyptic. Her body rose from the chair, not just levitating, but twisting, as if caught in a whirlpool, her limbs flailing like a drowning swimmer. A roar erupted from her throat, not human but primal, like the crash of waves against a cliff. Saltwater poured from her mouth, flooding the room, its briny stench choking the air. The seashell glowed with a blinding light, its crack splitting further, and a sound like a thunderclap shook the farmhouse, shattering the windows. "The deep will claim you all," she screamed, her voice a chorus of anguish and triumph, layered with Leviathan's rage. The crucifix on the wall burst into flames, then crumbled to ash, and the candles extinguished, plunging the room into darkness lit only by the shell's eerie glow. Outside, the farm was a maelstrom. The dogs, their numbers swollen, howled with a ferocity that seemed to tear the air apart, their eyes burning like coals in the snow. The lake's ice shattered, waves surging through the cracks, sending sprays of water that froze into jagged spikes on the shore. Frank, standing on the porch with Tommy, saw the lake boil, its surface alive with shadows that coiled and writhed. Tommy, clutching his wooden cross, whispered, "God save Mommy." Frank, his heart breaking, prayed the Our Father, his voice lost in the storm's roar. The snow melted around the farmhouse, forming pools that steamed with heat, their surfaces reflecting the serpent's image from the seashell. Laura Simmons, now a steadfast ally, stood with the priests, her cross gripped tightly. She'd found a final piece of lore in a crumbling text, describing a ritual to banish Leviathan by destroying its anchor, the seashell, but only through an act of selfless love. The text warned that the demon would demand a life, a sacrifice to sate its hunger. Laura shared this with Bishop Ellis, her voice trembling. "If we break the shell, we might free Pat, she said. But someone must pay the price. Frank, overhearing, felt a chill, his mind flashing to the diary's warning of a farmhand's sacrifice. He looked at Pat, her body twisting in the air, and made a silent vow. He would do whatever it took. The exorcism reached its climax. Pat's body spun faster, her form blurring as if dissolving into the water that flooded the room. She spoke in a language older than any the priest knew, a chant that shook the walls and made the air hum with power. The seashell's crack widened, its glow pulsing in time with the lake's waves. Bishop Ellis, his strength fading, seized the moment. He grabbed the seashell from Pat's hands, ignoring her screams, and ran to the porch, where the lake loomed like a living beast. "By the power of Christ, I cast you out," he shouted, hurling the shell into the lake. The water erupted, a massive wave rising as if to swallow the farm, and Pat's body collapsed, her screams echoing with Leviathan's rage. Frank, seeing Pat fall, ran to her, but the wave surged toward the porch. Without hesitation, he threw himself in front of her, shielding her from the water's wrath. The wave struck, pulling him into the lake's icy depths. Laura and the priest dragged Pat to safety, but Frank was gone, his body lost to the churning water. The lake roared, then fell silent, its ice reforming with a crack like a gunshot. Pat lay still, her breathing shallow, the scale-like marks fading from her skin. The seashell was gone, swallowed by the lake, and Leviathan's presence vanished, leaving a silence that was both relief and devastation. Pat survived, but the cost was unbearable. She awoke days later, her voice gone, her eyes haunted. She was free of Leviathan, but the demon had taken a part of her, leaving her mute, a silent witness to the sacrifice that saved her. Tommy, now fatherless, clung to his mother, his drawings now of angels instead of serpents. Laura, scarred by the ordeal, left Litchfield, her research abandoned. Bishop Ellis, broken by the battle, resigned 2 years later, dying soon after from exhaustion. The farm was sold, its fields left fallow, and the lake became a place of legend, its waters shunned by all. As an exorcist, I know that victories against evil come at a price. My colleague told me that Frank's sacrifice, his life given for Pat's, was the act of love that broke Leviathan's hold. The book of Job describes the serpent as untamable by man, but love, rooted in faith, is a power even demons fear. The Reading family's story is a testament to this truth, a reminder that even in the face of chaos, the human spirit bound to God can prevail. Yet the lake remains, its depths silent but waiting, a warning that Leviathan may one day rise again,